Hello everyone, I hope everyone is doing well today. My name is Luke Wood and I serve as Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity and Professor of Education at San Diego State University. And I'm glad to be here today to join you in this virtual convening. The title of my talk today is Black Minds Matter, the Education of Black Children in San Diego Public Schools. For the past several years, my colleagues at San Diego State and I have been working on a number of projects focused on the suspension and expulsion of children of color across our state. In particular, I've worked closely with my colleagues Frank Harris III, Mohammed Abdi Khas, Idara Essien Wood, Felicia Black, and Michelle DeJeanette. And we released a number of different reports that have highlighted issues facing black children in particular across our state. The first report we received was called Get Out. Get Out focused on the suspensions and expulsions of black children, specifically focusing on black males, and looking across the state of California. We titled the report Get Out for a number of different reasons, but one of the most prominent was that the movie at that time, Get Out by Jordan Peele, had just been recently released. And what the movie did, for those who have seen it, their main character was in what was called the sunken place, right? Where he was not in control of his own body, and what he was doing was looking up out through a portal of light to be able to see the world around him and what was going on. But in him and around him, he was enveloped in darkness, and he didn't know what to do. He couldn't, no matter how hard he screamed or no matter how hard he fought, he couldn't overcome this position that he was in, where he was essentially trapped within inside his own body. After the movie came out, Jordan Peele, the director of the film, was asked, what does the sunken place represent? And what he found was that the sunken place represents systemic oppression. It represents this notion that sometimes as people who come from minoritized communities, we know that there are things that are occurring that shouldn't occur. And no matter how hard we scream, no matter how hard we fight, sometimes we feel a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness that comes along with that. Well, if we think about what suspensions look like, particularly when we're talking about children in early childhood education, preschool through third grade, I think that that is an apt comparison. A sense of being not in control, a sense of hopelessness, and recognizing that we as educators have the tools and have the ability to be able to change that. Subsequently, we released a number of other different reports, one called the Capital Suspensions, focused on schools in Sacramento, another one which was a follow-up called the Capital Suspensions 2, which was just recently released. We released a report focused on San Diego County and San Diego Public Schools, Outside Looking In, and we released a recent report called When They Teach Us, which is a play on the Ava DuVernay documentary film, not a documentary per se, but a film that looks at a real-life event called When They See Us. And then we also released a report called From Boarding Schools to Suspension Boards, Suspensions and Expulsions of Native American Students in California. Throughout all of these reports that we've done, one of the things that we have found that has been absolutely certain and true is that when we're looking at suspensions, the highest rate of suspensions across our state, and yes, here in San Diego County, is for our black male students. Black boys in early childhood, latter elementary, middle school, and high school. These patterns begin early on and are incredibly concerning. We've also found throughout our work in collaboration with our partners from the Native American community that while the highest suspension rates are invariably across the state for black males, the highest expulsion rate are for Native American males. This represents one of the reasons why so many people have linked together the movements focused on dignity and identity for black and native peoples under the phraseology BIPOC, or Black Indigenous People of Color, recognizing that black and indigenous people as well as other people of color face incredible pressures in our society. I'd like to bring us to a quote from a scholar who is just really one of my favorite scholars of all time. His name is Asa Hilliard. He passed away many years ago, but he was a scholar in Africana studies and philosophy, in psychology, across numerous different disciplines. But he focused in the field of education in particular, looking at the experiences of black children and how they were treated and engaged by educators across the gamut. After years and years of research, he concluded with the following statement: "I've never encountered any children from any group who are not geniuses. There's no mystery on how to teach them. The first thing you do is treat them like human beings, and the second thing you do is love them." And that's what we're really talking about today, viewing education as an act of love so that we can be able to address the disproportionate impact or differential outcomes that face many of our students. Unfortunately, when we look across the state of California and here within San Diego, we see disproportionate impact taking place. We see differences in math achievement, reading achievement, writing achievement. We see differences in suspensions and expulsions. We see differences in referrals. We see differences in nearly every outcome that matters when it comes to either climate or success for our students. And oftentimes when we present this data to our colleagues, the response to them is to say one of two things. What the heck is wrong with these kids? Why aren't they doing what it takes for them to be successful here? And the second is, their parents aren't engaged. Why don't they care? How come they're not more invested? We believe that sense-making that looks at challenges that begins with that type of thinking will invariably lead to interventions that are designed to fix students, fix families, and fix their communities. Ultimately, that's not where we need to go. What we found in our work that a much more fruitful way of not only thinking about the problem, but actually acknowledging where the challenges are emanating from is to instead not look at the students, their families, and their communities, but to look inward at ourselves. To say to ourselves, what are we doing or not doing as a district, as a county, as a school, or in my classroom that results in our Black children not doing as well as they should? And have we created conditions that ignore or bar parents from their engagement? And when we start to have honest conversations, looking at those two lenses, one that focuses on students, families, and their communities, and one that focuses on educators and institutions, what we find is that the latter is far more influential in terms of being able to address the disparities that we see. According to W. Edward Deming, every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. Every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. So if we're going to change the outcomes that we see for our Black children, then it's not about changing them, their families, and communities. It's about changing the system, and that's ourselves. And I also think that in doing so, we have to bring the responsibility down to a personal level. It's one thing to look at it as every system, but how about every system, every county, every district, every school, every classroom is perfectly designed to achieve the results that it gets. One of the challenges that we have seen that has really served as a foundational issue that leads to many of the disparities that we see is implicit bias. Now, according to the Kirwan Institute, implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an implicit manner, activated involuntarily without awareness or intentional control, can be either positive or negative. Everyone is susceptible. When I look at that definition of implicit bias, there's a number of different things that stand out to me. First, that implicit bias can be positive or negative. We can look at some groups and think of them as being smarter, more moral, more well-deserving, and look at other groups and think of them as less intelligent and criminal and undeserving. It also says in the definition that everyone is susceptible. It doesn't say that most people are susceptible or that some people are susceptible. It says that everyone is susceptible. That includes you, that includes me, that includes everyone who's participating as part of this important convening. Another definition of implicit bias comes from Greenwald and Banaji. They say that implicit bias is characterized by introspectively unidentified or incorrectly identified traces of past experience that mediate attributions of qualities to members of social categories. Traces of past experience. Remember that, because I'm going to come back to that point in a moment. Encapsulating it all, implicit bias are the ways that we have tendencies to see groups who are different from us in either positive or negative ways. And unfortunately, when we're talking about the education of Black children, too often it is seeing them as problems, not solutions, as bad kids, not good kids, as criminals and deviants, not scholars and our future leaders. Now, when we look at implicit bias and the research on implicit bias, we recognize that part of what is taking place is that there's two different ways of thinking and processing information that essentially fall on a continuum from system 2 to system 1. Now, if you look at, there's a book by Kinnaman, 2011, called Thinking Fast and Slow. I would recommend that if you want to learn more about this, but there's also a lot of other resources on what this looks like. So let's start with system 2, because this is when we're less likely to convey bias to one another. We're less likely to engage in activities that don't express really what's on our hearts. So, a system 2 type of thinking occurs when we are employing our conscious reasoning and we are being explicit and controlled, which takes more effort. I like to think about it as we're thinking about every word that comes out of our mouths, how that word is formed, how people are receiving it, our body language, our eye contact, if it's culturally appropriate to do so. And ultimately, when we are thoughtful and engage in that type of thinking, it is more controlled. We are more thoughtful about what we say. It is higher effort. But in reality, most of us don't operate like that. We operate on a system 1 type of thinking. We're responding in the moment as multiple things are happening. I'm teaching my class on Zoom, and now I'm transitioning to doing something in the home, and the water heater is broken. I'll come back to that. And there's all these other things that are going on, and I'm trying to figure out how to just respond to things. So instead of thinking about every word that comes out of my mouth, I'm responding in the moment, I'm engaging people. It's employing our unconscious reasoning. It's more implicit, it's more automatic, and of course it's much lower effort. But the difference between the two is when you engage your mind like that, what is happening is that your mind is then filling in the blanks. It is then filling in the blanks with those traces of past information, which I'll come back to again. So, there has been a lot of research looking at when am I more likely to produce a system 1 type of thinking that is going to lead to me being more likely to convey bias. Well, it really comes down to 3 letters: I, T, and S. I, incomplete information; T, time is constrained; and S, stress. So according to Bertrand, Chu, and Molathian, this includes situations that involve ambiguous or incomplete information, circumstances in which my time is constrained, and times when my cognitive control is compromised when I'm experiencing stress or insufficient sleep. It can also occur when you are in a heightened emotional state. So, hot water heater, coming back to that. Let's say that we're outside, the pandemic is over, we're back in the classroom, and you're getting ready to go into the classroom and walk in there, and you get a call from home. Ring, ring, ring. Pick up the phone, and it says that the hot water heater is broken yet again. And you're thinking to yourself, I just got that dang thing fixed. Now you're angry. Now you're in a heightened emotional state. What happens then is that as you walk into that classroom, you are more likely to convey bias, because now what you're doing is you're pulling from those traces of past experience. You're being more automatic. It's lower effort. You're on autopilot because you're in a triggered moment. And that's why one of the biggest solutions that we have to a lot of these issues is to simply slow down, which of course is a very easy thing to say and much harder to do in our current society and in these current times. Now, coming back to the traces of past experience, I think that would be important for us to talk about further as well. And that relates to something that's called the primacy effect, which is the fact that individuals tend to give more weight to information which is presented earlier when forming opinions and making decisions. And we see this across all kinds of different fields, obviously in communication studies and also in sociology. For example, in communication, particularly in debate, it is known that the person who has the first argument has the strongest argument because everything that comes after that is now a counter argument. Many of you, for example, may have watched the nightly news recently and seen a panel discussion where you have your moderator who's in the middle, and then you have a box, another box of people who are being Zoomed in, Skyped in, or however they're bringing them in, and with the whole little Brady Bunch looking setup. And so they're getting ready to present, and they're going to talk about some important topic that they've already told you. And you know that like people have really prepared themselves for this, right? They went and they got their hair done just as nice as they could. They dressed appropriately. They had their notes, right? And they know that they're going to be on TV, that their families are going to see them, that their communities are going to see them, that the organizations that they represent are going to see them. And so they want to do a good job. And so sometimes when they even pan to them initially, you can see them looking down at their notes, being ready for that important moment when they're going to shine on television. And too often, what we find is this, that the moderator starts and turns to the side and says, oh, so-and-so, well, why don't you go ahead and get it started? What would you say in response to whatever this question is that has been posed? And what happens? Too often, that person, instead of talking about what the panel was supposed to be there to address, says something salacious, something out in left field, something that is meant to grab headlines and grab attention, that oftentimes isn't very closely tied to what the actual topic is going to be. They say something salacious, knowing that it will pull the panelists to come in to feel like they need to respond to that. And then afterwards, they spend most of their time responding to it. And sometimes even at the end of it, you get to the end of the panel and the moderator says, well, I'm going to have to bring you all back at some point. I know that we didn't get as deep into this as we would have liked to, or we kind of got off track, but there was an important discussion there. And we see this happen time and time and time again. And why is that? Because what's presented first has a strong influence in a debate context, but it also has a strong influence in a sociological context. The earliest experiences that we have help to encode within our minds how we should think and act towards groups that are different from us. So think about this. If you rode through with your grandmother or aunt or uncle or tia or tio in a car, and you're going through a neighborhood and they tell you, oh, this is a bad neighborhood. And they tell you to, back then, roll up the window, or now, pull up the window. Or they tell you to lock the door. Think about the uncle who may say things that are openly racist, sexist, homophobic, misogynistic. Think about even the subtle things. Let's go sit over here. Let's move this direction. Think about the messages that were on the nightly news. Searching for black male suspect. Searching for black male suspect. Searching for black male suspect. You might have been thinking to yourself, wow, is everyone who commits a crime a black male? Until many people began to realize that no, those are just the crimes that are highlighted because they're salacious. They grab headlines. They fit a narrative that, again, helps to reinforce biases that we have that oftentimes suggest that black people, and in particular, black males, are criminalized and criminals. So, these traces of past experience then go with us. And that's where, again, as we're engaging with someone in a conversation, teaching our class, sitting on a panel where we're making a hiring decision, whatever that might be, as we're making those decisions, those traces of past experience then influence what we say as we're using that system one type of thinking, because again, those characteristics of being more likely to use it is incomplete information, time is constrained, and experiencing stress. Now let's think about the current times that we live in. We are in the midst of two pandemics. Pandemic of COVID-19, which saw disproportionate infections and deaths and loss of life, incredible loss of life, and unemployment. And we're also in the midst of the racial pandemic, one that has lasted for, well, since the inception of our country, but I call it a pandemic because anti-blackness itself is not a U.S. phenomenon. It is a global phenomenon that has a unique strain here within the United States. And so, incomplete information, time is constrained, experiencing stress, those are qualities that typify the current times that we live in. Some of you might be saying, gosh, when you said that, I was thinking, well, that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's every day of the week for me. And it is for many people, particularly those who work in public education. And so what does that mean? It means that all of us are engaging in bias and communicating that bias to students on a daily basis. And the truth is, many of us are not as aware as we should be what that ultimately does. Now, this conversation is titled Black Minds Matter. But we also know that there is a parallel movement called Black Lives Matter that has focused on some of these issues as it relates to what takes place in policing. Names such as Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Oscar Grant, Amadou Diallo, Alfred Alongo, and far too many others are constant reminders that certain communities are perceived and engaged differently by those in law enforcement. But I want you to think about this. A police officer comes up into a situation, right? They've got a call from dispatch. The call from dispatch tells them, come on in, there's something going on. There is a report of a group of boys and one of them may have a gun. We're not sure. Could be a toy. We're not sure. Officer drives over, right? They've got incomplete information. They don't know fully what's going on. Their time is constrained and they are empowered with legal authority to make life or death decisions as they are armed. So, incomplete information, time is constrained. You see this gun, or maybe it's not a gun, and then they shoot. And we have names then such as Tamir Rice, who lost his life holding a toy gun. So when we think about that, it is a further impetus, and should be a further impetus, for us to realize that bias is happening all around us, and that if we're not intentional about making sure we are getting trained, that we are learning, that we are growing, that we are developing, then we'll never truly be able to address these issues. The truth is, every police officer in our nation should be going through ongoing training on implicit bias, on microaggressions, and how to engage communities from which they don't come from. When it comes to educators, we should be probably doing the same thing. Similar trainings. Now, last thing I'll say in context of this is there's been a lot of studies that have looked at bias in policing. There's a couple scholars out there, Sadler and colleagues, who've done a number of different studies looking at police officers and having them, bringing them to shooting ranges to measure implicit bias. A few of the studies that particularly stand out, and I'll kind of amalgamate them together here, are where they brought them to a shooting range. And then they've had white targets and black targets. So basically it's at a shooting range and they have suspects who are either white or black. And then some of them are armed and some of them are unarmed. So white suspects, black suspects, armed and unarmed. And then what they were told was this: if they are armed, shoot them. If they are not armed, don't shoot them. So simple. If they're armed, shoot. If they're not armed, don't shoot. Now, this is a conversation looking at issues of bias as it relates to black people. So my guess is you probably know a little bit about what they found without even reading the study. They found that not only were the officers more likely to shoot the black suspects when they were armed, they were also more likely to shoot them when they were unarmed. Moreover, in a subsequent study, they measured the time that it took for someone to make the decision to not shoot, and it took more time for them to make the decision to not shoot when it was a black suspect. How does this relate to schooling? Well, we believe that black lives and black minds are intertwined. If one does not value the life, then they certainly will not value the mind. And ultimately, when we see the outcomes in our schools, we have to recognize that there are some real challenges that we can face head on as a community if we are willing to do so. And these challenges have not been well addressed by those who've come before us. Maybe they've tried, but ultimately what we have to do is try harder. So it comes down to really three different patterns that we see in terms of how black children are engaged by educators that really leads to the disparate outcomes. And we call this the D3 effect: distrust, disdain, and disregard. Distrust, disdain, and disregard. So distrust refers to assumptions of criminality where it is assumed that black children, particularly black boys, are dangerous, deviant, up to no good, troublemakers, hyperactive, aggressive, overly physical. And these words are oftentimes attached to them. Problems, bad kids, and those labels, once they're attached to them by educators, oftentimes follow them for the rest of their educational careers. What is challenging about this is that oftentimes we find that these labels are applied to children who are simply being children, who are engaged in developmentally appropriate activities, who may have turned around in their seat one time or tapped a pencil on a desk, and it was possibly distractive. But does that make them a bad kid? No, that makes them a child who is learning, growing, and developing like any other child. Disdain. This refers to pathologizing culture and second-class citizenship. And it's essentially this viewpoint that black children are lesser than, kind of similar to what we see in terms of what Black Lives Matter has talked about in terms of the undervaluing of black lives. This is really the undervaluing of black minds. So pathologizing culture is when the values and communication styles of a particular group are viewed as being lesser than. And second-class citizenship refers to seeing a group as largely overall as being lesser than. So think of this as what happens when these notions of either values or communication styles or communities or families are perceived to be lesser than. And then the last one is disregard. Disregard refers to ascriptions of intelligence, where it is assumed that black children are less academically capable than their peers. Now, when we look within each of those, distrust, disdain, and disregard, there are further patterns that are important for us to keep in mind. First, we know that black children are assumed to be troublemakers when it comes to distrust. They're oftentimes then hyper-surveilled and monitored for wrongdoing. They can be misidentified when no wrongdoing has actually occurred. They are oftentimes, and this is the most prevalent theme that we have seen, singled out for punishment. So as an example, let's say that we have a group of 4 boys who are in kindergarten, and they're on the schoolyard, and they're throwing rocks against the fence, and one of them is a black child. They're throwing rocks. Now, let's be real. They shouldn't be throwing rocks, but they're also in kindergarten. They're learning, they're growing, they're developing, they're gonna make mistakes. What we oftentimes find is that the reaction by the teacher is categorically different based upon the race of the child, and that black children are oftentimes singled out for discipline when it is done differentially for their peers. So in that context, that example, the black child may lose their recess. They might get a note that's sent home while the other children might get a warning. Or maybe even sometimes actions that are even more egregious than that. They're also what we call subject to reverse causality. So reverse causality occurs when you have a child who comes to a teacher to tell them something that has happened to them that shouldn't have happened, to bring that information to the teacher. And when they bring it to the teacher, the teacher may question what they did to cause it. So let me give you a perfect example. A reverse causality could be a black boy in first grade who was pushed by another child. And instead of pushing back, he did the right thing. He goes up to his teacher and he says, "Darren pushed me." And the teacher's response is to say, "Well, what did you do to cause this to happen?" That's what reverse causality refers to. And we see this far too often. We also know that they can be the recipients of quicker punishments and more harsher punishments. One child gets a referral, they get a suspension. One child gets a warning, they lose recess. Or two children get suspended, but one suspended for a 1-day in-school suspension, and one receives a 3-day out-of-school suspension for being engaged in the exact same behavior. But again, because of perceptions of malintent, they can be viewed differently. And then the last common pattern that we see as it relates to this is being viewed through what we call a disorder-based lens, where it's assumed that there must be a breakdown, that the child must be emotionally or behaviorally disturbed. Now, we've collected a substantial amount of data on this over the years, and a lot of that data has focused on what's taking place in San Diego County. I'd like to read to you a few examples of what we're seeing and what we're hearing from parents. Now, this is part of a larger study called Our Voices, and I think we've had at least at this point 5 different peer-reviewed journal articles that have focused on this study. In addition to that, we have done a number of conference presentations that have looked at this, but this is based upon data from hundreds of parents now who contributed narratives talking about the experiences of their children in school. And these are examples that are specifically drawn from San Diego County. Here's what the first parent said. "The teacher repeatedly described my 7-year-old child as aggressive because he put his all into winning at sports and games. I had to interject numerous times reminding the teacher that my child is competitive, not aggressive." Here's another one. "My son started preschool when he was 18 months old. When we arrived for the conference, the parent-teacher conference, we sat down expecting to hear about how our son was making new friends, playing and doing art. Instead, we spent the next 45 minutes hearing that our son was physical and aggressive, that he put his hands on people. We heard that he was very busy. These are things that she wanted to make us aware of. I couldn't help but wondering, is this accurate? Did the teacher not like him? Why not? When I think back to that conference, I do not recall a single positive remark." Here's an example of being singled out. "An incident happened where a Caucasian kid pointed at a rainbow, and about 3 other kids looked. I remember the main administrator specifically naming and shaming our son. Our son is quiet and tends to follow a crowd. He can get mouthy when questioned, but what kid doesn't when he's singled out when 4 other kids seem to get a pass? It doesn't help the situation, but I can't blame him. It seems unfair." They are also, again, recipients of quicker and harsher punishments. One parent said, "When he is disciplined, it is harsher and more stern than his non-colored counterparts who participated in the same events. There appears to be some fear from the administration of him, despite him being a normal kid into Minecraft and being generally very well-mannered. Of course, they see him through the lens of he's a danger because they're conditioned to believe he's a danger." This plays out in the state of California in numerous ways, but most prominently through the suspension of students. Based upon data from 2007 and 2018 school year, looking at kindergarten through 3rd grade, we find that the statewide average for suspensions was 1%. So that means that 1 out of every 100 kids was suspended if they were in grades kindergarten through 3rd grade. However, when we look at our black students, we find that this rate is exorbitantly higher. Specifically, 6.1% were suspended on an annual basis. Now that's a unduplicated suspension. That's not counting for a kid who is suspended multiple times within one school year, or multiple times in kindergarten, then first grade, then second grade. It is only looking at where they suspended at least once, again, kindergarten through third grade. We've done studies in a recent report looking at Sacramento, which found that Black children in early childhood were 10 times more likely to be suspended than their peers. This rate is egregiously high, and it's followed by a similarly egregious suspension rate for Native American males at 4.2%. Or I should say Native American boys, because again, this is kindergarten through third grade, whereas the statewide average is only 1%. Now, we also see this here in our own county. A couple years ago, we released a report focused on San Diego County called Outside Looking In, and I'd encourage you to access that report. It's on our website at ceal.org, that's cceal.org. Now, when we think about distrust, disdain, and disregard, we also have to remember the disregard piece and recognize that adjoined with this notions of criminality are ascriptions of intelligence that sometimes assume that Black children are academically inferior. Now, when on our qualitative data, we found a number of different patterns that are pretty prevalent as it relates to this. First is our assumptions that the child is unintelligent, or praising other children for academic successes and not praising them when they perform similar duties and functions. Avoiding rewarding them for their academic successes, putting them down in public when they provide a wrong answer, conveying a sense of surprise when the child succeeds academically, making the child prove their intelligence in the classroom when others aren't asked to do so, and then in some ways linked with what we just talked about with assumptions of criminality is there were assumptions of criminality where you would find the assumption that they may have a disorder, emotionally behaviorally disturbed, similarly that the child has a learning disability. Now, when we look across these issues, again, looking at what are some of the things that we're hearing from parents in San Diego County, here are some quotes. One parent said, also, his third grade teacher didn't give him recognition for being good till the end of the year. She didn't recognize the good he did after way too much time had passed. Another parent said, in second grade, her teacher gave out awards to the children. She was among the top students in her class, neck and neck with one little boy. However, her name was called with only passing interest, while everyone else was given a nice speech about their accomplishments. She received nothing but a piece of paper. Afterwards, I could tell that she was upset. And so I lied to her. I told her that the teacher had pulled me aside to tell me how great she was because I wanted to protect her. Another parent said, my daughter is now in second grade. We spoke with her being the teacher, and gave her information about Sarah's shy demeanor and that she is such a smart individual. With that said, I'm not sure she read our email or believed it. She placed our daughter on a reading level of 15 when she was a 20, the highest in her class the previous school year. I asked her to retest her because there was no way my daughter was performing that low, especially with our very productive summer. She tested her and said, wow, she is actually smart. Those words, actually smart, have stuck with me as a parent. It's been one of the most hurtful responses about my daughter. I'm sure it wasn't purposeful, but it was painful because there was doubt. Doubt that my daughter could perform well. And the last example I'll give is this, and this is from another parent. When my daughter started kindergarten, we had a teacher mention that she thought my daughter had ADHD and would need special services for her attention. I asked her if she had tried to change anything in the classroom. She said that she had not. It turns out that Sarah had only been in her class for 4 weeks, and the class was a bit out of control. The teacher had no control over any of the students, and the students did not pay attention. But there were about 5 to 6 African American students who are in that classroom. Once the teacher came into that class, and in this context, the teacher came into the class halfway through the year because there was a transition of another teacher who went out. The 5 to 6 black children, all of them were referred to special education services and placed at a desk together at the back of the classroom. This is San Diego County. Now, in terms of how we can change the things that I've expressed here, there's a lot that we can do. And we believe that it all starts with what we call the pyramid of success. So imagine a pyramid. And at the top of the pyramid is student success, which is ultimately where we want to go. Too often, if we're trying to improve outcomes, our focus is on how we can be more effective in our teaching practices, our syllabi, our teaching demonstrations that we're doing with students, the PowerPoints or Prezis or whatever is being used by the teacher. It's focused oftentimes on effective and engaging practices, which is important. It's absolutely critical. But if we're talking about resolving the challenges that we face for black children, it's not where the solution lies. At the base of the pyramid, we believe are perceptions. Changing perceptions on how we see students and their families, and also how we see our role as educators. And going back to the quote from the very beginning from Asa Hilliard, how can we bring love into our classroom? How do we have perceptions that don't assume that we should engage a child with distrust, disdain, and disregard, but instead extol their brilliance, their dignity, and their morality? Doing so requires substantial training on bias, on microaggressions, culturally mediated behaviors, and a number of other topics that are of critical importance. But ultimately, we must remember that our perceptions influence our teaching. Now, the second rung up on that pyramid is relationships. Relationships that are typified by trust, mutual respect, and authentic care. Trust, that the child can trust you, that they can confide in you. Mutual respect, that you're down to earth, that they can talk to you and have a conversation. And authentic care. Oftentimes when I talk about authentic care, there's a challenge in people understanding, well, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to have authentic care? And this is what authentic care looks like. It is a shared or linked vested interest, where if the child does well, if they perform well, if they hit their mark, if they succeed, if they get the score that they were hoping to on the test or on the paper, that you are going to personally feel like you did well. But on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, if they do something that falls outside of what they would hope for themselves and what you would hope for them, that you are going to personally feel like you didn't do well too. Because there's such a connection there, a shared or linked vested interest in one another. So going back to it all, the base of the pyramid is perceptions. Perceptions influences our relationships, which is the second step of the pyramid, which then influences how we can do the effective and engaging pedagogies and practices, which is that third step. And ultimately, when it all works together, it can lead to student success. I'd like to conclude with just some basic advice that I think would be helpful for schools and for districts within our county. We believe that it is absolutely essential that if we want to change the outcomes that we see, that we begin to implement intensive, ongoing professional development for all educators on implicit bias, racial microaggressions, culturally mediated behaviors, and teaching practices for Black children. Doing so in a political environment that is typified by dissension and contrast can be difficult to do. But it's incredibly important that we find ways to make this happen. And the county is one of the groups taking the lead in making sure this occurs by hosting convenings like this today, as well as all the ongoing programming that they continue to do around issues of equity in education. We also believe that we need to establish, either within districts or within the county, an exclusionary discipline task force that can investigate districts and schools in our county with egregiously high suspensions of Black students, and other students for that matter, but looking and identifying those schools. Now, I have a list of schools, many schools in our county that have suspension rates that are at 30% and above for Black children, meaning that approximately 1 out of every 3 Black children is suspended from that school and higher. We believe that those schools need to be looked at more closely, that obviously there's a need for more support, that there's a need for more coaching. The first thing that everyone can do is begin by going to the California Department of Education, go to DataQuest, and look at your own school and see what are the suspension rates, what are the success rates. Look at your district. What are the expulsion rates across the district? How can we work as a community to address it? The first step to having change is awareness, and too often, most people don't know that that data is readily and publicly available. Third recommendation is to enhance school resources to identify and support students who have experienced personal trauma. Now, I want to recognize that when people use the T word, trauma, too often what they do is they use it as a way of talking about things that occur outside of schools that may then come into schools. And certainly, COVID-19 has caused trauma. Certainly, the social unrest after the murders of so many Black people, Black men and women, and individuals from our Black transgender community, that too often there has been, the result of that is personal trauma that has been experienced by children. But in addition to that, it's also important for us to recognize that trauma also comes from schools too. A child who is in an environment that is not loving, that is not supported, will not flourish like we know that they can. And in particular, as I say this, my mind is on those children in kindergarten through 3rd grade who continue to have suspension rates that are exorbitantly higher than that of their peers. We believe that because there are so many of our foster youth who continue to have suspension rates that are exorbitantly higher than they should be, that we need to have policies in place that require the social worker or the child's attorney to be involved as independent representatives when the child is subject to a suspension. We also believe it's important to provide avenues for students to report educators who they feel are unduly targeting them for discipline, with follow-up with students afterwards. Now, I don't mean to say this in the context of we need a system to report people, which of course we do need mechanisms to make sure that information is being shared with the appropriate officials. But what I do mean by this is this. I have sat down as part of our work with numerous children in kindergarten, and they can tell you right away who the teachers are who are mean to them, who the teachers are who are nice to them, the ones that are going to give them a hug, the ones that are going to yell at them in front of others and make them feel small. At every level, we know that children have the ability to be able to identify when these things are occurring. And I want to say this. The truth is, a lot of these things that we talked about, the most egregious challenges, aren't every educator. It's usually a smaller group of educators at a particular school who continue to suspend and refer and expel. But the other part of this is, part of being equity-minded means that we have to hold one another accountable. So, if there is a school of 100 teachers, obviously there's probably not, but if there's a school of 100 teachers, and you have 5 teachers who continue to do this, and 95 teachers who don't say anything about it and don't intervene, then you have a school of 100 teachers who are concerning, not just 5. Because remember that as adults, we have power, we have privilege, and we have the responsibility and duty to ensure a healthy environment for all of our children. And the last recommendation I would extend is to expand the implementation of restorative justice as an alternative to school suspension in order to build communities and restore relationships between all affected parties. The only challenge, of course, with that is a conceptual challenge. If our experiences in K-3, in early childhood education, are not demonstrating to Black children that they are loved, then restorative justice may not work, because you cannot restore a relationship that was never there to begin with. I want to thank you all for being part of this important convening. I want to thank you for your dedication to the students in our community and for the incredible work that you've done throughout the pandemic, trying to ensure a semblance of normality when there is no normality to be seen. And I would just conclude by saying, Black minds matter.